Autumn whispers good night as the brisk winds begin to blow, and with them came the sounds of faint cries. On this brisk fall night, while Moria was peering into her crystal ball, searching for new spells to cast, she heard faint cries in the distance. Her ears perked up, and she frowned. Meanwhile, at a small farm up the road, a very small mouse was primed for sleep by her parents Cleaver and Medusa. But when she was placed in her cozy bed, she began to cry. A very small mouse was the one locked away in the dungeon beneath the cottage, her tiny voice echoing in the cold, dark cell. Moria the witch, lazy as ever, with her keen hearing still could not ignore the heart-wrenching sobs. With a sigh, she bolted out of her crooked cottage and into the night, her tattered cloak billowing behind her. As she neared the farm, the goofy shriek fumbled from the treetops. "Who's you?" echoes through the silence. Moria, startled, paused, then said, "Shut up, you stupid goofy owl." The owl went on about his business. She stood there and didn't know what to do. The problem required some thinking, and that was something she loathed. Thinking was for other people. She was, after all, a lazy witch who preferred others to do her bidding. Moria knew plenty of spells but refused to voice them aloud, claiming they were all trapped in her head, where they belonged. "If only the world could read my mind," she'd often mutter. Moria scratched her head, trying to figure out the situation. Finally, she grumbled, "I suppose I'll have to get Daniel Thorne." Daniel Thorne was her loyal, sleek black cat and unusually wise for a cat. He had solved many of Moria's problems in the past, often with little effort. With a wave of her phone, her meager wand, she summoned Daniel Thorne from the shadows. His glowing green eyes reflected the moonlight as he gracefully approached, tail flicking in curiosity. And again a curious, "Who's you?" echoed from the treetops, and Moria said, "Don't pay him no mind." "What was that?" he asked. "It's just that stupid goofy white owl." "Are you besmirching its character?" Daniel Thorne asked. "Carry on," she said hurriedly. "Anyways, what is it this time, Moria?" he purred, slightly exasperated, as if already knowing she needed help. "Do you know what time it is?" he exclaimed. "It's early, it isn't late, and we need to retrieve a very small mouse from the dungeon," she said, gesturing vaguely toward the distant faint cries. "But I can't figure out how to do it." Daniel Thorne sighed, his whiskers twitching in amusement. "Very well, but you're going to have to cast something this time. I can't do all the work." Moria groaned but followed the cat, knowing that together they could save a very little mouse, whether by spell, wit, or sheer laziness, as Daniel Thorne would probably be the one to act on her behalf. Moria shuffled behind Daniel Thorne, her cloak dragging through the damp grass as they made their way around the cottage. The cries grew louder, and Moria winced, annoyed that something so small could make such a racket. Daniel Thorne stopped at the cottage's door, sniffing the air. "There's magic here," he murmured, his eyes narrowing. "Of course there's magic. It's a cottage on a farm in the middle of the haunted Carlithian forest," Moria muttered. But when Daniel Thorne gave her a sharp glance, she realized what he meant. There was another kind of magic, a dark, twisted sort of real magic from a real witch, not a lazy one that didn't belong. "Well, do something," Moria demanded, trying to shift the responsibility onto him as usual. The cat sat and flicked his tail. "Moria, you're the witch, not me, by the way. This is your task. You must at least try to unlock the door or something. This is something you can't brush with your broom." Moria grumbled, not fond of being forced to act, but she reluctantly raised her hands. She had once been a great sorcerer, when she bothered to cast spells before her werewolf husband died and before the fall of the emperor. She thought for a moment and whispered an incantation under her breath, and the lock on the door clicked open. "There," she said, brushing imaginary dust off her hands. "That wasn't so hard." They slipped into the cottage, the air thick with silence now that a very small mouse's cries had faded. It was as if the whole building held its breath, waiting. Moria glanced around the small, cluttered room, her eyes falling on a trapdoor in the corner. "That'll be the dungeon," she said with a sigh. Daniel Thorne padded over and scratched at the door. "Locked again," he said, shooting her a look. "Oh, fine. Moria huffed, waving her phone. I mean her meager wand to unlock the trapdoor with another muttered spell. The door creaked open, revealing a staircase winding deep into the ground. They descended into the dungeon, the air growing colder with each step. The walls were lined with stone, and faint wisps of fog curled around their ankles. At the far end of the dungeon, sitting in a tiny, shadowed cell, was a very small mouse. She was even smaller than Moria had imagined, her fur soft and white, her eyes large and tearful. This is the mouse who stole my pumpkin seeds, Moria said. How do you know? The cat asked. I can smell my seeds upon its breath, she muttered. But as they approached, Daniel Thorne stopped short, his ears flattening against his head. Wait, he whispered. There's more to this. Moria blinked, confused. What do you mean? Daniel Thorne pointed with his paw. Look closer. This seems like a trap. Moria squinted at the little mouse. Something shimmered in the air around her. A spell, a curse perhaps. The mouse's small form flickered, and for a moment, Moria saw something else. Something larger. Something far more dangerous than a very little mouse. An illusion, Moria muttered, feeling a shiver of excitement. It had been a long time since she'd encountered anything this tricky. The mouse isn't what she seems. Perhaps she's a shapeshifter? Daniel Thorne nodded gravely. If we free her without breaking the spell, she may become something else entirely. Something powerful. Something dark. Moria sighed again, her earlier laziness fading into reluctant determination. I suppose I'll have to break the curse, then. She knelt beside the cell, tracing her fingers along the enchanted bars. But I'll need to speak the spell aloud, she grumbled. Daniel Thorne smirked for once. With a deep breath, Moria began to chant, her voice low and steady. The air around them shimmered, and the walls of the dungeon seemed to pulse with energy. The mouse's form flickered again, growing larger, its shadow stretching across the floor. As the last words of the spell left her lips, the mouse transformed. Moria fumbled her spell once again. In its place stood a tall vampire, his eyes glowing with ancient magic. He smiled at Moria, a hint of mischief in his gaze. Thank you, witch, he said in a voice that echoed through the chamber. You have freed me from my prison. But I wonder, have you made a terrible mistake? Moria blinked, unsure if she had just rescued an ally or unleashed something far worse. Daniel Thorne looked up at her, his eyes wide with concern but with curiosity because he liked the vampire. You're welcome? Moria said hesitantly. The vampire laughed, a sound that filled the dungeon with both warmth and a hint of menace. We'll see. To be continued.